The morning light came in sideways through the shutters, striping the kitchen floor gold and white, and the coffee was already on. He shuffled in wearing the same rumpled raincoat he always wore, even here, even in Rome, even in July, and he stood at the little stovetop espresso maker and watched it like it might do something unexpected. It always did, eventually. He liked that about it. His name was Columbo, just Columbo. He'd been a lieutenant once, a long time ago, back in Los Angeles, back when the job was everything, and Mrs. Columbo kept the basset hound from eating the couch. Now he was retired, officially. He drank his espresso standing up, the way the Romans do, and he looked out over the rooftops of Trastevere. And most mornings, that was enough. This was not most mornings. The phone rang at 7:43. He knew the number. Ispettore Ferretti, Polizia di Stato. A good man, a careful man, the kind of man who only called when something was genuinely wrong, and not just wrong in the ordinary way. Colonnello, Ferretti said. He always called him that. Columbo had given up correcting him. Ispettore, you're up early. I have not been to bed, Ferretti said. We have a situation. The Galleria Borghese, a body, American national, cultural attaché to the embassy, found this morning by the first curator through the door. He paused. The gallery was locked, alarmed, no sign of entry, no sign of exit. The cameras show nothing after 11 o'clock last night. Columbo scratched the back of his neck. He looked at his espresso. He looked at the rooftops. That's very interesting, he said quietly. That's a very interesting thing. Every man I have is standing in that gallery right now, looking at each other, Ferretti said. I need someone who looks differently. There was a silence on the line. A pigeon landed on the sill outside and regarded Columbo with the particular contempt that Roman pigeons reserve for tourists and the recently retired. I'll need a few minutes, Columbo said. I haven't finished my coffee. He hung up. He finished his coffee. He found his notepad, the small one, the spiral-bound one with the broken cover, in the pocket of the raincoat, right where it always was. He patted it once, the way a man pats the shoulder of an old friend. Then he put on his hat, picked up his car keys, looked at them, remembered he had no car here, put them back down, and went to find a taxi. Outside, the city was already warm and loud and magnificent and completely indifferent to everything, the way Rome always is, the way it has been for 2,000 years. Columbo walked into it with his hands in his pockets, and he was already thinking. He was already thinking when he walked through the tall glass doors of the Galleria Serrano, and he was still thinking when the room went quiet around him. The gallery occupied the ground floor of a palazzo on the Via della Croce, and it was the kind of place that made a man feel underdressed, even if he had dressed at all, which Columbo, it must be said, had done only approximately. The other people in the room were wearing things that cost more than his car. Not that he had his car, but you understand the point. There were 4 of them gathered near the back, beside a large canvas that no one was really looking at. There was Renato Fabbri, the dealer, silver-haired and smooth, with the careful smile of a man who had never in his life said exactly what he meant. Beside him stood the Danish diplomat, a tall fellow named Brandt, who held his champagne glass with 2 fingers and watched Columbo the way you watch a dog that has wandered into a clean kitchen. Then there was a young woman, an assistant of some kind, who wrote things in a notebook and never looked up. And there was the countess. Columbo had been told about the countess. He had not been told enough. Her name was Eleonora Caravita di Montesole, and she was perhaps 60, perhaps 70, perhaps something else entirely. She wore a dark green dress and a rope of pearls that looked old and important, and she was the only person in the room who seemed genuinely pleased to see him. Lieutenant, she said, extending a hand, we have been expecting someone official. We did not expect someone quite so. She paused, and her eyes moved briefly to his coat, informal. Yeah, I get that a lot, Columbo said, patting his pockets. I hope you'll forgive me. I left Rome this morning without really, well, I left in a hurry. My wife always says I should keep a spare jacket somewhere, but... He stopped. Anyway, I just have a couple of questions. Very routine, very small. Fabrice stepped forward with the practiced grace of a man who intended to control the conversation. The painting in question, he explained, had been authenticated twice, The provenance was ironclad. The theft, if it was a theft, was an inside matter, probably a disgruntled employee, nothing more complex than that. Columbo nodded through all of it, his eyes moving slowly around the room. He noticed that the countess did not nod along with the others. She just watched him with those calm, amused eyes, and when Fabry finished, she said nothing at all. "Thank you," Columbo said. "That is very helpful. Really, very helpful." He turned toward the door, then stopped, turned back, one finger raised. "Oh, just one more thing. The authentication report. The second one, specifically. Who actually requested it?" The room was quiet. The countess smiled. The countess smiled, and Columbo let that smile sit there in the air between them like a piece of evidence he hadn't quite picked up yet. He thanked her again, very warmly, apologized for taking so much of her evening, and shuffled out into the Roman night with his hands deep in the pockets of his raincoat. The cobblestones were still damp from an afternoon shower. Somewhere behind him, a motor scooter complained its way around a corner and disappeared. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. He walked, and he thought, and by the time he reached the Piazza della Rotonda, he had it all arranged in his head like a room he'd been trying to furnish for days and had finally found the last chair. The Pantheon rose in front of him, enormous and indifferent, the way old things get. Dottore Renato Galvani was already on the steps, which meant he'd been expecting this. "Dottore," Columbo said, climbing toward him with that apologetic, lopsided walk of his. "I'm sorry. I know it's late. I know you're a busy man. I couldn't sleep. You know how it is. And I kept thinking about that ring." Galvani said nothing. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the calculation that guilty men's eyes always do, running the numbers, checking the exits. "The signet ring," Columbo continued, almost to himself. "The impression in the wax on the second authentication document, the one you said Marchetti sealed before he died." He paused, tilting his head. "Only the impression is smudged on the left side, just the left. And Marchetti was right-handed. Everyone said so. His tailor, his secretary, his housekeeper, right-handed." He let that breathe for a moment. "You're left-handed, Dottore." The word landed quietly, the way the most important words do. Not a shout, just a fact, set down on the steps of the oldest building in Rome. Galvani moved first, which Columbo had expected, and the two carabinieri who had been standing at a respectful distance near the fountain moved second, which Galvani had not. It was over very quickly and without much drama, which was, in Columbo's experience, how most things actually ended. He stood on the steps a little while after they'd gone, looking up at the portico, at those columns that had been standing since Hadrian's time and would be standing long after everyone involved in this business was forgotten entirely. He thought that was probably fine. Then he turned up his collar, because the night had gotten cool, and walked back in the direction of his rented room and the small espresso maker he'd bought at a market on his second day, and which had, against all odds, worked perfectly every single morning since. He was, he decided, going to miss Rome. Just a little.